So Jeffrey Towson, thanks for joining me today. It's a big pleasure to have you here.
No, thank you. I appreciate it.
What really made me keen to have this conversation was one of your podcasts I heard recently about how a lot of the digital stuff that companies do today is not really a competitive advantage anymore. I guess it's kind of logic because everybody's doing it, but I just felt that you really coined it, and I wanted to unwrap it here with a little bit of your your points around sort of what a digital normal business is doing, and what we as investors can look for if we want to see competitive advantages, more durable competitive advantages. And you have some really nice illustrations about that. So we'll be looking a lot into that. But and then maybe putting on some company examples to get some examples on it. So could you start out by just explaining on a high level this concept that doing digital stuff is no longer a competitive advantage?
Yeah, I mean, I break this into two buckets in my brain, which people talk about all the time, but it's a moat or it's a operating performance question. And there's a lot within each of those buckets, but a moat, I would argue, is a structural advantage. So the standard analogy is horse versus the jockey. Some horses are faster than others. That's a structural advantage. But some jockeys are better. That's operating performance, which is a combination of management, culture, key activity. And there's a lot underneath, let's say, operating performance. And I think one of the, in my opinion, mistakes that's widely, let's say, commonly made is both of these two levels are changing because software, digital, data technologies are changing how we do everything. And as they change, oftentimes what would just be considered an operating activity that has a digital mechanism is considered to be some sort of big moat. Usually because it's something people haven't seen before. It would be like the first retailer that figured out how to open stores, and all the other companies, this is a bad analogy, let's say all the other companies were catalog companies, and they'd be like, oh my God, they have a store opening competitive advantage. And I'd say, no, that's just a new type of operating activity. Everyone's going to be doing this in a couple of years. It ain't that big a deal. Well, I mean, it matters, but so I think a lot of what we talk about, I call them the digital operating basics. Most companies are doing this. And the examples I pointed to were like Netflix and Amazon Video, where a lot of the stuff people said, oh, this is a tremendous moat of Netflix. And I'm like, I think they're just doing the digital basics for video. They just got there first. Everyone's going to be doing this, which now we're seeing HBO Go, HBO Max, Peacock, blah, blah, blah. So I think these things tend to be mischaracterized.
Let's zoom
That's
in
what
on,
I sort of
on
call the digital. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Let's zoom in on the digital operating basics. I put them on here, sharing the screen, so people should be able to see. And what I'm sharing here is simply just your website, Jeffrey, where your podcasts are, and there are articles for subscribers, and it's really great stuff if you want to look into digital businesses and sort of have a model to break them down. I've been learning tons from your podcasts and websites, but here are the digital operating basics. So tell the audience about what is it that you think are just sort of table stakes, something that any company needs to be doing today to be operating at a sufficient speed to compete? Yeah.
I mean, this list, I've listed 7 digital operating basics. This is not my list. I mean, this is not my thinking. This is, if you do digital transformation work with companies, which I do, this is standard stuff, right? So I don't want to say this is mine. It's really not. How you build moats for digital businesses, that is probably 70% my own research, but this is not. And, it really depends. Like, if we're talking about Starbucks, there is not a lot of digital operations going on. They have an app, they do a little delivery, but it's actually not that big of a deal. But if you're going into video or banking, which is inherently an information business from top to bottom, it's all about the digital operating basics. So you kind of got to know your industry. Let's say healthcare and manufacturing are, kind of traditional operations plus a digital component. So you got to kind of break it apart. But within the digital component, these 7 are a pretty standard list. You'll hear this from, the McKinseys and the BCGs and the Capgeminis and all that stuff. This list, there's also a guy who's called Ram Charan who writes about this stuff a lot. About half of this is his. The ones that people point to are, it's usually 3. 3 get most of the attention. Number 1 is DOB3, Digital Operating Basics 3, which is, look, you have to make the core operations digitized, which is about, let's put sensors in everything. Let's track all our inventory in real time. We're 7-Eleven. We've got warehouse cameras. You're digitizing the operations, which means you're getting really good data visibility for the first time. That tends to be the biggest lever. Suddenly the analogy I use is, it used to be if you were a CEO or a senior manager, you would get reports every month, written, handed up. That's like being out in the world and it's all dark and you're walking around with a flashlight and you point the flashlight at things and that's your monthly report. You can see within the beam, and suddenly they turn on the lights and you can see everything. That's
in real time. That's
the digital core. That's when suddenly, holy cow, on my screens, I can see the entire business now. I can see everything. I know what's moving in every store at every 7-Eleven. And it rained on Tuesday and we saw beer spike in this warehouse. And when we did this promotion, the numbers moved. Suddenly it's like the lights got turned on. So DOB3, the digital core, it's a lot about, you don't have to automate your software and you don't have to automate your operations, but you do need visibility. And the data comes from internal, the data comes from the market, from partners and others. So it's called DOB3. People talk a lot about that. Then usually people talk about DOB2, which is never-ending personalization and customer improvements. This is just like digital 101. As soon as we get data in a company, we immediately get as close to the customer as possible, study what they like and what they don't like, and we iterate as fast as humanly possible, which is what Amazon does every day, which is what, when Facebook runs, whatever it is, 30,000 experiments on the platform every year. That's them taking their data visibility and just iterating like mad to continually improve the customer experience. And and that race never ends for most companies. You do that forever. So those 2 get a lot of attention. The other ones, I can go through them if you want.
Just from a high level, just to give people an idea of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, DOB1 is just rapid growth. One of the benefits of, if you're going to do anything digital in a company, go for growth, because one of the things about the economics of digital is it doesn't cost you anything to grow, which is completely insane. If you're going to sell 10 apples, you need a bunch more trees. If you want to double your volume, but you can sell Netflix in every country in the world and your cost structure doesn't change. That's unbelievable. So don't be in digital and not go for growth. It's like the biggest lever you can pull. DOB4 is about connectivity, that it's easier to, most businesses connect with about 10 to 20 partners, suppliers, marketing agencies, software vendors, because that's kind of what you can manage as a company. Software can connect with thousands of companies without problem. It's one of the benefits of software. We can connect with everybody. So connectivity tends to matter. And then DOB5, DOB6 are about people, culture. Why does ByteDance iterate so fast? Your average, ByteDance, I don't know what the number is now. They launch probably a couple hundred apps every month that they prototype and test. Meanwhile, Airbnb and Facebook, I can't think of a single improvement they've made in 5 to 10 years. Some companies have a cultural management process, team-based. There's a whole world within leadership and culture in digital companies that's, people write books about that. Amazon is one people talk about a lot. Alibaba, I think Huawei, which I write about, I think they have an unbelievable culture. Like I'd never compete with that company in anything. Anyways, so that's kind of 1 through 6. And number 7 is just operational cash flow. Whatever you're doing in your digital core requires, let's see, your digital operating basics requires ongoing investment. It's a game that never ends. So therefore, whatever you're doing in your digital basics has to produce cash flow. Otherwise, you're running on VC money, and it's hard to just, you see this with Amazon. Amazon is like a digital company from top to bottom. They make a ton of cash and they just flood it all back into their digital capabilities year after year. It's really hard to match that. Anyways, that's 7. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. You're living in Asia, and I think the companies you're looking at there is probably has incorporated a lot of this. But when I look at European companies, there are some of these which I think that people sort of think that's really cool when they can do it. The big tech is doing a lot of personalization, but I think a lot of smaller companies in the West, especially in Europe, is not as far down this trajectory as in being good at personalizing products and experiences. And I think it's interesting coming from you that this is sort of being basic in Asia. Do you think there's a difference between sort of the different parts of the world?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's Asia is very good. I think this was Kai-Fu Lee said this, like the US is very good at inventing new things, creating new things, AI models, algorithms. Asia is very good at implementing. Like, they take existing algorithms and they just implement them like crazy. And a lot of the, the most famous apps here, they're implementation stories. They're just really good at doing stuff on the ground on the B2C side. Now, if you look at the B2B side, enterprise, Asia, China is, not counting Japan, is behind what we see, let's say, in the US. And let's say Europe, Europe is a lot more complicated because you see a real, you look at some German companies and they're incredibly impressive. And then I've met with retailers out of Italy and we just talk about the basics and it's like, we're not there. They're just, so it's a bit of, Europe for me has always been a bit of a mix and match scenario. A lot of cool stuff, but then other stuff's pretty far behind. I mean, you got to look at it at the granular level. Hospitals in, a lot of Germany are awesome. So.
Yeah. So in your book, you wrote a book just now, or are writing. Some of them are available on Amazon now. The first 3 parts of the book, I think it's called Moats and Marathons. And it's about how to build and measure competitive advantages in digital businesses. So, so we're unfolding your thoughts on that on a high level today. And you have sort of 2 things. I'll bring up the pyramid here, which is your sort of way to illustrate it. And at the bottom, you have the things that we sort of just talked about now, which is operations, which is not really a durable competitive advantage. You just need to have better people and execute better in this category. And then you have the upper part, which is moats and competitive advantages. Could you sort of tell us about this pyramid here and your framework?
Yeah, I mean, we call this the 6 levels of digital competition. I mean, I really went down the rabbit hole, to be honest. I mean, I basically wrote a textbook. I mean, this is an academic, well, not academic, a full textbook, which is a little bit crazy because that's not usually what business people like to read. But I'm going to release it in 5 to 6 parts. But these are short little books. I'll come up with something more digestible in the future. But I sort of boiled the ocean. And okay, so I broke it into 6 levels. Why did I break it into 6 levels? Because when we break it into 6 levels, the top 3 are about moats, structural advantage. This horse is faster than that horse. The bottom 3 levels are about operating performance. This is your average restaurant. Your average restaurant on a street has no structural advantage. The only way you compete with the restaurant across the street is you just operate better. And you're all basically doing the same activities. So it's all about who can do these 10 core activities better. If you're competing on operating performance, that's it. I generally like businesses that have a structural advantage, and then you have a structural advantage, and then you're also competing on operating performance. You have to do both. But that's generally where I focus, is building structural advantages, moats, which people often use these words differently than I do. Yeah, and then
you have the horse and the jockey. So the horse is sort of the top of the pyramid, and the jockey is the bottom of the pyramid. So it's really nice to have a good jockey, but if you also have the fastest horse, that sort of makes the race a little bit easier.
Yeah, I don't like to play fair. Like I think playing fair is too hard. I don't like to do it. I've opened a couple restaurants. It was terrible. I never want to do it again. It's so hard. No, I like to have an advantage that I like to be able to do things others can't do. I want to avoid competition as a fundamental strategy, is avoid it because it's hard work. It never ends. So I'm looking for structural advantages. And that's what people call moats, durable advantages, franchises. People use different terminology. Now, the reason I kind of broke it out in detail, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 levels, and within each of those, I've detailed it out. 15 types of competitive advantages, 7 digital operating business, is because I wanted to be able to have sort of a granular look so that when a new digital tool emerges, AI, IoT, I don't know, robotics, I wanted to be able to see how, because there's always new digital stuff coming. I wanted to be able to see what got impacted and what didn't, such that I could say, okay, this new tool everyone's talking about, AI, computer vision, it's going to hit competitive advantage here and here, but here, here, and here, you're fine. So it lets me sort of assess the impact of technology on various business models. That's why I kind of did a very granular look at it. And that's pretty much, talking about Netflix and Amazon Prime Video versus Amazon e-commerce. That's basically why I said, look, I think this assessment people have of Netflix has been wrong for a long time.
Yeah,
I think the current situation was predictable.
Perfect. Let's let's talk about Netflix, about sort of how you don't see as many structural advantages there, and as an example of a company that are more that don't have as many of those, before we move more into looking at the competitive advantages. That would be perfect.
Yeah, I mean, Netflix has often been used as an example of, oh, this has got a competitive advantage, which I don't really think it does. When you looked at Netflix, the story has traditionally been over the top content bundle, very low price, super convenient, kind of their standard story. And that is a comparison against traditional cable packages and other types of studios, television, whatever. So we're comparing they basically came up with a business model that leveraged in new digital tools and capabilities, created a new business model that appeared quite strong versus the traditional business model. Okay. However, when we look at what they're doing, what do people talk about? Well, it's all digital. We have a very low cost structure. Hence, my Netflix subscription is like $4. We personalize. Everyone gets different selection. Okay, well, that's fine. That sounds like personalization. We make it convenient and easy to use, the customer experience, which Netflix talks about all the time. We're all about making whatever the customer wants. No commercials, skip the intros, binge watch if you want. Okay, all of those things I just said are pretty much the digital operating basics we just went through. Move to a digital operation, digital core, never-ending personalization and customization, go for scale. That's DOB 1, 2, and 3. That's most of the Netflix story. So my first assessment would be, it looks to me like you use digital tools to build a new business model that was doing the digital operating basics quite well, and when compared to the traditional model, appeared quite strong. However, now we are seeing, now you're no longer competing with cable, you're competing with other businesses using the same business model as you. You're the first restaurant on the street, but now we have new restaurants opening. It doesn't look to me like the things you're doing are any sort of advantage over those. They're doing the digital operating basics. You're doing the digital operating basics. This looks like three restaurants competing against each other. So I think it's sort of like people overestimated the fact that they moved to a digital operating model first, which is good. You want to be a first mover and you want to implement those. That's not the same thing as a durable advantage. That's more of a short-term advantage.
And then they had scale advantage. They sort of reached a really good scale first, but others can get there.
Right. So that would be one way of looking at the business. Okay. And this is not uncommon. When we see a new digital business model emerge, usually they don't launch on day one with a big structural advantage. Usually they launch with some operating advantages. They have a window of time where they get big, they digitize, and they have a window of time to then build in a structural advantage over time before the competitors copy what they've done. You could say the same thing about Zoom. Zoom was not doing anything terribly different than Skype or anyone else. In fact, you could argue that video communication is pretty much a commodity technology. But they got there first. Well, they didn't get there first. They did it better than Skype. They moved quick. They were outstanding at the customer experience. Reliability, and that gave them a window of time to then build a competitive advantage before everyone copied what they were doing. Now, I don't think they've really done that yet. I know they're trying to, they talk about it, but I don't think they have. So we could say the same thing about Netflix, that you had a window of time by being a first mover with a digital operating model against your traditional incumbents to build some structural advantages. But now
what
that we
they
see
have
them,
been, do you have any, what structural advantages could Netflix have built?
Right. Okay. So like, I'll give you the standard story. The standard story you'll hear about Netflix is, and we could say the same thing about Amazon Prime Video. They have economies of scale in content. Okay. There's usually, people point to two things, although they use different language than I do a little bit. Number one is you have economies of scale. Because you have such a massive user base, you have a fixed cost on in-house content development, and you spend $10 million, $20 million, whatever it costs on a movie, your per unit cost, your per user cost is lower because you can spread the costs out. Standard economies of scale. They're bigger than their competitors. That would be one. The other one is they actually purchase a lot of content. They license it. Well, they're going to have a purchasing advantage the same way Walmart has a purchasing advantage because they negotiate better terms, lower price. So you could say they have two advantages on the cost side. Okay, that's sort of the story you hear a lot. And then some people say they have a data network effect, which I think is not a real thing. I think that's just personalization. Okay, I think they have somewhat of a purchasing cost advantage. If they want to license the Friends shows, they can probably get better terms than a smaller competitor because they have such a massive user base. That's the Walmart type advantage. I think the economies of scale one has been misunderstood. Economies of scale is something they talk about like Alibaba or Amazon spending on. Amazon e-commerce has economies of scale in IT spending and logistics spending. They outspend their competitors every year as a percentage of their revenue. And that's why they spend more on logistics, smart logistics, IoT, that's what they do. The same way Coca-Cola has a economies of scale advantage in marketing spend. They just outspend everyone because they take a percentage of their revenue and they spend it on marketing, and there's Coke ads everywhere. I don't think that works in quality content. And I think that's what we're seeing in Netflix right now. If I want to build 10 warehouses and my competitor's building 3, I just spend 3 plus more than they do. If I want to make quality TV shows, am I really going to end up with more quality TV shows if I just ramp up my spending? If I have the Beatles and I want to create 5 more Beatles, the band, do I just write a check? No, it turns out creating quality content at scale is not just about spending money. And I think you can see this with Netflix. They're spending a ton of money and their shows suck. I mean, they're really try to think of a good show they've created in the last year. So this idea that you can create quality content as a spending advantage, I think is probably incorrect.
Yeah, it's totally. We've seen Amazon try to make good computer games for years and sinking a ton of cash into that. It's hard to find sort of that secret sauce that really makes content or entertainment quality or catchy or whatever. So yeah, I guess it's something different.
Right. So I think that one's not what people think it is. I think they do have two advantages that I would put in the structural level. Number one, they do have purchasing economies, maybe not in Hollywood, but if you go to Brazil and watch Netflix, you're going to see, a huge portion of that content is going to be Brazilian content. I think they probably do have a purchasing advantage when they go to the Brazilian studios and say, we'd like to buy, whatever your show. And the other one is what I would call a barrier to entry. And I think about those things differently: barrier to entry, competitive advantage. To play in the streaming game, you do need an IP library of sufficient size to be a viable product. You can't just jump into this business and say, I'm starting the Jeff streaming company. I have 10 shows. I could open a restaurant and say, I have the Jeff restaurant, and I could open one and it works fine. There's a barrier to entry that you do need a sufficient library of content. I think that does protect them to some degree. I think Disney jumped it. They put together enough content to make a viable product. HBO has maybe done it, but HBO has a much smaller suite of content, but it's high quality. So they do have a barrier to entry there that does limit every Tom, Dick, and Harry from jumping in like they do in restaurants. But I don't see a whole lot in terms of structural advantages there that's going to protect them.
No.
So what I would have predicted was going to happen was they'd have a window of time, they'd do very well, they'd kick the butts of the cable companies, but eventually there's going to be 5 to 10 to 15 and maybe more streaming companies that pretty much do what they do. And prices, there's going to be a lot of pricing pressure. There's going to be a lot of pressure to spend more on content and spend more on marketing. There's going to be more churn. That's what we'd expect to see in a system without serious moats. And I think that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, and you're sort of moving into to the moats and structural advantages parts of the talk here. So could you talk about the top of the pyramid that we're looking at here with the structural advantages?
Yeah, I mean, I break 6 levels. Top 3 levels are about structural. Bottom 3 levels are about operating performance. I call them Warren Buffett and Elon Musk land. Warren Buffett buys companies with structural moats, right? That's what he does. Elon Musk yells at him saying there's no such thing as moats, there's only innovation. So I call those 3 levels. I think you need both, which I think is not exactly a big insight. Top 3 levels, I talk about fortresses, which is the top level, then competitive advantages, then barriers to entry. And I think barriers to entry and competitive advantages are 2 different things, which people mix. Some businesses are hard to enter, but once you get into them, the people you're fighting, your rivals, they don't have any advantages. Other businesses, they're easy to enter, there's no barrier, but once you get in there, like let's say soda, your rivals have tremendous advantages. So I could open a soda company tomorrow. It's very easy for me to do that. I could enter, no barrier to entry. But once I get in there, I'm against Coca-Cola. They have massive competitive advantages. The flip side to that is if you want to open a hospital in a small town, there's actually a pretty big step to jump into that business. You got to build the building, you got to hire the staff, you got to get it. Before you can see one patient, there's a fixed cost to jump in. But if I could jump the barrier, once I got into it, the local wouldn't have any real advantages. And some companies have both. And I think that's kind of what's protecting Netflix a bit, is to jump into this business, you do need a sufficient IP library to be a viable product.
It's expensive to
it's expensive, but maybe not. I mean, maybe, I'm not sure I'm right about that, because Netflix has a very clear value proposition. It's the Walmart model. We have everything and it's really cheap. But there's other types of value propositions for consumers. HBO could come in and say, look, we don't have 10,000 crap shows. We have 200 high quality shows. Consumers may well go for that, right? There's different value propositions you could do as a streaming service that maybe don't require a global IP library.
So barriers to entry, they can be sort of economic. And I also hear you talk about difficulty. There is such a wonderful example of that. There is a company called dLocal, which does payment services. So they take a country and they make sure that no matter what type of payment service the customer in that country wants to use, they can facilitate it, and then they sell their service to Nike or big companies wanting to sell abroad. And I heard the CEO talk about when they started to look at payments in Bangladesh, they were like, this can't be done. It's no way it can be done. We cannot do this. And then he was like, yeah, then that's why we're going to do it. That's why we're not going for Germany or something where it's kind of easy, because once we've done it, nobody's ever going to try to do it again, because we are behind that barrier to entry. So that's economic and difficulty. Are there any other types of barriers to entry?
I look for, my standard question is, what is the cost, timing, or difficulty? Those are my three words: cost, timing, difficulty. If you're going to launch a mobile network in Thailand, you can't offer the Jeff mobile service and we only cover half of Bangkok. I have to offer the whole country from day one to sign up one customer. So that means I got to build base stations across. There's a cost to do the whole country. Okay. That's just writing a check. The other one would be cost, timing, difficulty. Timing. Let's say I want to create a whiskey. Whiskey, Johnny Walker, they benefit from legacy brands where people have been hearing the name Johnny Walker probably their whole lives. There's no way I can replicate that in 1 year. Doesn't matter how much I spend. Certain things just take time and there's no way to force it. Warren Buffett talks about this. He says you can't make a baby in 1 year. No, you can't make a baby in 1 month by getting 9 girls pregnant. Certain things, especially legacy brands, you can't write a check. It just takes time. And that's a very defendable situation. And then the other one is difficulty. If you're going to create a new pharmaceutical, it's not just like writing the check. You know, it's hard. It's very difficult. If you're going to make a hit movie, which is, I think, the Netflix thing, it's not just about the money. It's actually, you need talent. It's hard. It's difficult. So I look at those sort of three variables. And then I look a lot at digital platforms. If you're going to build a platform business model, which gets us into the digital world, everything I just said, we could have talked about traditional businesses. When we move into digital, we see other types of barriers to entry. Building a marketplace platform, connecting the merchants of Bangladesh with the consumers of China for payment. In a connected world and digitized world, there's new difficulties to doing things. People talk a lot about the chicken and the egg problem, that if you're going to start a marketplace or other type of platform business model, you know, to get the buyers, you have to have the sellers, but to get the sellers, you have to have the buyers. So getting it started is difficult. They call it the chicken and the egg problem. That's a barrier to entry. You know, VCs talk about that all the time. They call it the cold start problem.
But actually, when I sort of listen to this, like in old days, when you wanted to build a new marketplace in a city, you had the chicken and egg problem as well. You just couldn't start Jeff's Town and do a marketplace. So now it's just digital, and I really think that's kind of what is so interesting here, that just being digital is not enough anymore. You need to build these structural advantages and look for them in the digital world as well.
I think you can get both. I think there's, like, why did Warren Buffett buy a railroad? It's because it's impossible to create another one. How could you possibly
Yeah.
create rail lines across a fully developed United States? What are you going to buy every piece of land? No, the days are over when you could do this. That is a hard barrier to entry to create a railroad that covers a country once it's been developed. I think that's a lot of why he did it. And then it was the lowest cost. They had a cost advantage as well. But there are definitely barriers to entry, which is level 3. There's competitive advantages, which is level 2, that are different for digital and different for traditional or physical businesses. I like e-commerce because you can get network effects, which is a competitive advantage, which is digital, and you can get a physical warehouse infrastructure that's a barrier to entry. I like having both. And Netflix, I would say, because it is a purely digital creature, you really don't want to be in a purely digital business without physical assets if you don't have a competitive advantage. You really don't, because it's too easy for others to jump in when they don't have to build 900 warehouses. And usually the one you go to for content is a network effect, which YouTube has and TikTok has, but Netflix does not. So that's kind of why Netflix, I was kind of like, yeah, this company's exposed. Now, if they had tons of warehouses or something, I'd feel differently about it. But yeah, you take it apart systematically, and usually you can get a picture sometimes.
And you're sort of moving into like the Amazon business model, because Amazon is really building a lot of these barriers to entry and structural advantages. So could you break that down with Amazon as an example, what they're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote an article basically saying that Amazon Video is a weaker business than everyone thinks, but the e-commerce is actually stronger than everyone thinks. It's an unbelievable business model. Like when I run the number, I mean, I just do my checklist, right? And it's just, I mean, it is a powerhouse of a business model. So let's say we look at, competitive advantages. They don't have a lot on the consumer side. They have branding awareness, but people aren't checking into Amazon e-commerce 20 times a day like they're checking WeChat or Facebook. They have some stuff there. It's not awesome. Switching costs, is it difficult to switch? For consumers, not so much. Switching costs tend to be on the merchant side. If you get merchants to build their business on your platform or build their TV show on YouTube, they can't leave. Although the Amazon Prime gives them some switching costs on the consumer side. The big one you get to when you run the list, the first big one is network effects. I mean, Amazon e-commerce has tremendous network effects. I mean, you're talking about the marketplace. They have a retailer and they have a marketplace model, right? The marketplace is in 19 countries, $400 billion worth of GMV, millions of sellers joining every year to two. I mean, it's unbelievable, just the marketplace network effect they have going. Economies of scale. Now, economies of scale in quality content, I don't think works very well, but I think it works very well on IT spending, which is where if you look at the fixed costs of Amazon, you're going to see a lot of logistics spending and a lot of fixed cost spending. Variable costs, you're going to see delivery costs and marketing costs and others. Okay, they're just flooding money into R&D, logistics, and IT every year. They're outspending everybody by a mile. I mean, let's say Amazon's CapEx, I'm looking at the number, 2020, Amazon CapEx was $35 billion. That was 3 times what Walmart spent that year, which is about 10. And their next competitors, Target and Home Depot, they both spent 2 to 3 billion. So they're tenfold. Now, if you're spending on smart logistics, smart warehouses, quicker delivery, all of that, yeah, that's probably going to work. They have purchasing economies, which is, they act as a retailer as well as a marketplace. So they're negotiating discounts with sellers around the world. They're getting cheap prices. Walmart does the same thing. You start to look at barriers to entry. How much would it cost to replicate their IT system, their warehouses, their global footprint? I mean, it would take you a decade to replicate what Amazon has built, a decade of spending. So someone could do it, but you'd see them coming from a long way off, and I like that. They have a platform business model, and then you move into the digital operating basics, and you see they're doing everything there. They're digital at their core. They have a tremendous culture. They're personalizing. They're going for scale. I mean, they're basically running my 6 levels, like at every point. And so my conclusion, all of that is, I think as time goes on, they're actually getting stronger.
And what are they buying with all that capex? Could you just zoom in on that? Why does the logistics spending make sense? What are they building in your framework here?
Yeah, for a long time, I mean, you have to build stuff that customers care about, right? If you just spend money on stuff they don't care about, it doesn't work. Okay, what do e-commerce consumers care about? They care about delivery speed. That was a big lever for a long, long time. If you buy from Amazon, you get it in a day. If you buy it from a competitor, you get it in 3. Everyone chooses Amazon. It's just consumer behavior, right? They also care about the perception of free delivery, which is funny. Even if you tell them it's free and then you bake the cost into the price of the item, consumers still love it. Like, for some reason, they love fast and they love free delivery, or at least cheap delivery. So for a long time, flooding money into logistics warehouses, Amazon has basically built a version of FedEx. That got you faster and cheaper delivery, and it turns out consumers really care about that. Now, that will flatline at a certain point. If you can get everything you need in life in 6 hours, going to 5 hours is probably not going to make much difference. So, they'll tap that out eventually. But there's a lot of other stuff going into smart logistics, robots, automated trucking, automated delivery. I mean, there's a lot to mine there. You get a lot of benefits on inventory management. Spending on logistics, smart logistics, if you look at Amazon, JD, Alibaba, it really does seem to be a deep well of value creation, at least for now. It may run out. So yeah, there's just a lot to do there. And when I talk to some of these companies like JD and Alibaba, I always ask them, what are your top 3 priorities this year? Logistics is always in the top 3.
Yeah, that's amazing, because it's really not in the investors' top 3. It's in kind of the bottom 3. Every Amazon investor is complaining about the capex that is being spent in Amazon logistics these days. So it's interesting.
Yeah, we can broaden that out. Logistics plus IT and web plus a retail footprint. That's what Alibaba calls new infrastructure. So Alibaba has basically become an infrastructure company with an e-commerce product sitting on top of it. So, they could open up their logistics services to every merchant to send things the same way they've opened up their IT infrastructure as Amazon Web Services. So at a certain point, Amazon starts to look more like an infrastructure company that provides services to everyone else in the US economy, as opposed to just an e-commerce player. And that's kind of what Alibaba is doing. They're trying to be the infrastructure. They call it the new infrastructure of commerce. And they want to take 1 to 2% of all commerce in China, which is a much bigger opportunity long-term. Who knows? So, we can broaden that out, but it doesn't seem to me that they have tapped that mine yet. It doesn't appear that they've run out of opportunity.
No, it seems like doing the e-commerce stuff, that's really becoming table stakes, just having a web shop, and that's digital operating basics. So the new stuff in this value chain is actually to do the new retail model that Alibaba is doing, where you incorporate everything into a value chain with unified data. And you were on my podcast, the Axio University, and told us about JD Logistics when they were listed and they came out as a platform. Do you think Amazon will will sort of do the same thing, or will they stay integrated?
I mean, like economies of scale based on fixed costs, that's a big lever on the supply side, on the cost side. What these digital companies do is they all do the same trick, which is really smart. You're spending money on IT services, you're Amazon, you're 3 times bigger than your closest competitor. So therefore your fixed cost in IT is 3 times theirs. Fine. That's an internal capability. But then they externalize this capability and they offer it as a service to the whole market. That's Amazon Web Services. When they do that, they get tremendous economies of scale, because suddenly they're not just outspending their e-commerce competitor on their own internal volume and revenue, they're outspending them based on the whole market spending. So Amazon did that for Amazon Web Services. JD went further. JD did it for IT services, which really didn't, they're not a major player there. It's more Alibaba and Huawei. But they also did it for logistics. They externalized their logistics capability as a service for everybody. And they took it public, and you can see the numbers. It's not obvious. It's an awesome business to me. But that's like one of my biggest questions for Amazon is, are they going to externalize their logistics capability as a independent business serving everyone like they did with their tech spending, AWS? They look like they're in a position to do that if they want to. And that, one, it might turn into a good business, Amazon Web Services. 2, it also just takes your economies of scale advantage through the roof relative. If you want to compete with Alibaba, am I going to have to replicate both the e-commerce business and AWS just to compete with their e-commerce? And the answer is yeah, kind of. Yeah. So JD did the same playbook. Alibaba did the thing that neither of them did, Amazon or JD. They did the same playbook for physical retail, where they bought hundreds of hypermarkets, they launched hundreds of supermarkets, they bought department stores, and they built all the tech to basically use this as a type of infrastructure. And then they're going to offer that tech to every merchant and supermarket that can use it. So they're going to do the same playbook in that bucket. And we haven't seen Amazon do that.
No, but it's coming. It makes sense to have a unified channel down the line. So in this, we're looking at this pyramid here, and you have one place where you have a gray box in between the operations and the structural advantages. And it's kind of how internal resources can grow into structural advantages. And sort of, could you talk about how a company can use what they learn from operations and sort of turn that into structural advantages?
Yeah, I get into arguments on Twitter on this, which is a terrible idea, because like it's a terrible place to discuss anything, where people say, look, you have a moat or you have operating activity. These things are different, horse and jockey. They're actually linked. What is a competitive advantage? What is the competitive advantage of Walmart? It all follows from their physical footprint of stores and warehouses and trucks, right? That's part of it. And then they have purchasing economies as well. Okay, but where did those come from? Like, where did it's like competitive advantage is one side of the coin, but resources are the other side. A competitive advantage is a reflection of something you have built. It's a manifestation of a resource or a capability you have built over time. So Walmart didn't just end up with lower logistics costs. That manifested itself after they had built a network of stores with high density in the central, sort of Arkansas region. They did this as an operating activity that created certain resources and capabilities, which then manifested themselves as an advantage. But you don't get one without the other. How did Coca-Cola, let's say Coca-Cola's competitive advantage is more on the demand side. It's how people think about it. It's share of the consumer mind, which would be a Buffett term. Well, how did they get into people's brains? Well, they spent money on marketing for 50 years, 100 years. So their operating activities created a phenomenon, which is their presence in people's minds, and that's now showing up as a competitive advantage. So these things are linked. Walmart's operating activities, their operating performance was a lot about opening and managing stores. That's how they got their resource base, which is now their advantage, right? So these things could have, and what happens is it's actually a process, because you do operating activities that creates assets, resources, and capabilities, which then are reflected as advantages, but they can also decay. They can be disrupted. Blockbuster, if we would look at Blockbuster in 1995, their operating activity was, we're good at opening stores, we're good at running stores. We built a big network of stores across the US. That is manifesting in our competitive advantage. But then digital technology disrupted their core asset and made it worthless, and their model fell apart. So oftentimes, these resources and assets are what digital technology takes out, and then the business model falls apart pretty quick. So yeah, there's a linkage there, and you're always creating assets, and assets are always decaying, becoming obsolete, or being disrupted. So it's a bit of a cycle. But you got to look at all three of those things together.
That's so interesting, and yeah, there is tons to talk about and to unwrap. But I think this is a good point to sort of end this. We've been around on a high level your framework, and it's so interesting. I really love this focus on just being digital is not really a structural advantage. You need to keep building these structural advantages. Could you just tell us about what you do in the end? You have a subscription service, you have a book, and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I wear two hats. Is, you know, I do consulting for companies, and, you know, digital transformation, strategy, and investing. And then the other hat is, you know, writer, speaker, professor, sort of this stuff. And so I have books out, do a lot of keynotes around the world, companies, corporations, and then there's a subscription service on my webpage, which is jefftowson.com. And that's your standard podcast and email distribution. And, you know, how many companies have gone through 500? It's kind of crazy how many companies have added up over time.
It's really great to look into and look around into and revisit. I really like your content, Jeff. Thanks a lot for being here and telling about this. I think it's so exciting.
Nope, it's been a pleasure. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jeff. Bye.